Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Stefan Livera Podcast, brought to you by Swan.com, the best place to buy Bitcoin. Rejoining me today is Dr. Guido Hülsmann. He's a senior fellow of the Mises Institute. He's a member of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. He's a professor of economics at the University of Angers, and he has written numerous books and given so many talks, notably Mises, The Last Night of Liberalism, The Ethics of Money Production, and most recently, Abundance, Generosity, and the State. So first of all, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, sir. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I have to say, Dr. Hülsmann, I really enjoyed this book. I think there was a lot of really interesting insights, and I hope my listeners are, after hearing this interview, they'll also be inspired to go and read the book as well. But let's start with this question. What spurred you to write this book? Were there elements of your previous book that spurred you to write this one?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I had started becoming interested in gratuitous goods only 2009, when Pope Benedict XVI published an encyclical with the title "Charity in Truth." And so I'm a Catholic, so as a good Catholic, you're supposed to read all these encyclicals. Doesn't mean that you adopt this rule and bench, but you need to give this serious consideration, right? So it's not really something that you have to believe, like you would believe the Ten Commandments or something like this, right? But the popes typically publish encyclicals when they feel there is a subject of current importance that is underappreciated and that needs to be given more thought and action. And in that case, it was the principle of gratuitousness. So the Pope felt, well, actually the most important goods in human life, such as love, hope, friendship, and so on, are always gratuitous. And of course, we cannot do, as human beings, we cannot do without payments, we cannot do without markets. But still, he had the impression that markets were taking the upper hand and growing at the expense of gratuitousness. There was something wrong going on. And he said, well, all the faithful and actually all people of goodwill, even if they're not Catholic, should give this some attention and figure out what's going on and possibly find out what can be done about this. So that's my logic. So I, at the time, was involved with other things. I was more interested in the economics of financial markets and capital theory and so on, and didn't have time to set aside for this. So I asked a doctoral student to look into this. So I had this doctoral student, and she worked on this for a couple of years and then defended her dissertation in 2015. And I felt after the work, so it was there was no other dissertation on the topic before, right? So it was breaking new ground, but then she was a beginner, and unsurprisingly, she didn't have the full command of all the literature and things that might be relevant. So I thought, yeah, I have to go over some of these things again. And in particular, as far as two topics were concerned, one is what the economists call positive externalities. So it's all the side effect goods that might exist in a market, or that might result from market interaction, but even outside of market. This was one thing. And the other thing is, and this brings me back to your question, the other thing was the influence of the monetary system. Because I had this impression, and I said so also in some previous texts, most notably in the Ethics of Money Production, about which we talked last time, that the government interventionism entailed a tendency for people to become more materialistic. And so this clearly seemed to have something to do with this topic, right? If people care more about money and more about themselves, well, that seems to be a reason why they might turn more cold-hearted and be less generous in their attitude toward others and so on. So I then set out to spell this out in more detail and elaborate this. So this was the starting point. But then, as very often in research, things get out of hand. And rather than covering just these two topics, I eventually set out to write a treatise on gratuitous goods, because there was no such treatise than before. And that's what the book is, right? So now it's 400 pages on gratuitous goods. It's more than enough. It's not gratuitous reading, right? So many friends told me, oh, Guido, it's fine, you have this book on this gratuitous, but it's not gratuitous to read. Yes, I know, there's a lot of time investment involved. But anyway, that's how it is.
Time well invested, I say. I really enjoyed it. I think there were a lot of really valuable insights. But before we go into some of those, let's start with just, the basics. What is a gratuitous good?
Well, actually, as I explain in the book, strictly speaking, there are no gratuitous goods. What is gratuitous are the ways we receive an economic good or provide an economic good to others. Right? I mean, if I give a pair of glasses to somebody, then it's not the glasses that are gratuitous because the glasses have been produced by human labor, so there was often a monetary cost involved, certainly opportunity cost, and so on. Right? So it's not the good itself that is gratuitous, but I provide it to others without payment. So that's gratuitous, and the other person might receive it without any payment. And so when we talk about a gratuitous good, so it received gratuitously, meaning that it is received without any prior obligation on the part of the person who provided it. So gratuitousness can only be defined within this normative context, a context of rights and obligations, right? It's a good is gratuitous only to the extent that it goes beyond what I owe, and to the extent that it's received beyond what I have the right to claim. Right? If I have the right to claim, for example, somebody steals my wallet, and then I say, well, give me a wallet back. He hands the wallet over. Well, that's not gratuitous. He doesn't make a gift, right? And even Robin Hood, right? If he gives money to the poor that he stole from the rich, strictly speaking, that's not a gift. It's a restitution of money that had been stolen from these people. So it's returning it to them, right? So in a very similar way as you can define inflation only within the context of pre-existing rights and obligations, the same thing here as well. Gratuitousness can only be correctly defined, I think, in this normative context. And that shows that well, there's a strong connection, right, between rights, obligations, which are per se juridical moral terms, and economic analysis as soon as it touches on such things, right?
Yeah, and so as you rightly point out, it comes down to what is your theory of justice, right? Like, what are you rightly owed, or what may you rightly claim from that other person? If
Yes.
I've done this work for you and you owe me my salary, but actually, if you give me some other benefit on top of that, thing on top, that might be a gratuitous benefit because that wasn't something that I could claim from you per se.
So it shows again, right? So the central importance of private property rights, because private property rights are, of course, the most important institutions that we've created, humans, in order to delimit what is owed and what is no longer owed, or what can I claim and what may I not claim. As I can always claim, but what do I righteously claim, right? And so in private property rights are, of course, fundamental also for exchange, so for contracts. And the very purpose of contracts is to define the obligations and the rights of the partners. So within that context, within the world created by private property rights, you may have such a thing as gratuitous goods, which implies, on the other hand, that as soon as you no longer have private property rights, as soon as you are in a moral juridical limbo in which there are no clear boundaries, well, there is no more gratuitousness. There are no more gifts. And that's what some anthropologists, Bronislaw Manilowski and others, found in the early 20th century when they investigated the manners and the lives of primitive tribes in the Pacific basin. So it's around the world. These people actually have no conception of a gift. And that's, of course, not surprising, right? Because in order for things like a gift to even become conceivable and then also to be experienced, well, it presupposes a context of limitations of rights and obligations. If everything is in the limbo, everybody has a right on everything, everybody is somehow, but not precisely defined, obliged to do all things, it's impossible to make gifts. It's impossible to receive anything gratuitously because you always had already from the outset some sort of claim on all other things.
And when it comes to gratuitous benefits, one area that you touch on in the book is around virtues and sacrifice. Right now, these are not necessarily tangible things that you can hand to somebody, but maybe it's more the attitude, the way you behave, the temperance, the wisdom, the judgment, these kinds of aspects. And you mention how people have to effectively sacrifice to train other people to have this virtue. Can you elaborate a bit on, your treatment there of virtues and sacrifice?
Yeah, sure. I mean, virtues, of course, it's the right way of behaving, even if materially there is nothing coming out of you, or quite to the contrary, you're undergoing some sort of a cost, right? And of course, the only way to teach this to other people is, in particular, your children, because I mean, either you teach it to your children, or the children will have a difficult time learning this from anybody. Is precisely doing the right thing, even if it costs you.
Effective.
If in the extreme case, it costs you your life. Less extreme case, it costs you your job. Other less extreme case, well, you lose an opportunity to make money, or to live in a nice place, or to marry the girl that you love, and so on, right? So whenever you live the virtue, you do what's right, even though it doesn't benefit you materially. And the only way to teach us is actually to see people doing this, and doing it therefore for the right cause. And children see this right away, right? They see right away the dishonesty and hypocrisy. Right? People say, yes, I'm doing this because I love you, but really they're doing this because they hope to get something in return later on, right? And so that's not the way to teach virtues. And actually, people who are only confronted to this sort of opportunistic behavior, well, never can really behave virtuously. It's very difficult. I mean, you need to have a lot of spiritual gifts to get out of this.
Yeah, and as part of gratuitous goods, you also mention in some of your treatment here, now we're not getting to the government intervention, we'll get to that later, but you mention things like the possibility of tit-for-tat exchange or customary gifts. And
Yes.
so there's this dynamic where you might be giving a gift, but actually there's an expectation being placed on the other person.
Yes.
Maybe
Yeah.
I buy you lunch today, and then you feel like you have an obligation to buy me lunch the next day.
Yes, and absolutely, right. And let me just point out that, of course, there's nothing wrong with this, right? I mean, my book is not a treatise on morals or something. It's an economic book, so in which I want to analyze different causal connections. And so, of course, in real life, you always have tit for tat, and there's nothing wrong with tit for tat. I'm not pointing my finger and saying, oh, you shouldn't do this. You should always be pure and make pure gifts and so on. My point in the book was simply to point out, yeah, from a logical point of view, what is involved in a true gift, right? In a genuine gift. And then, of course, in real life, you have a lot of hybrid forms that are somewhere in between market exchange, in which the purpose is just to benefit materially, and acts of donations, in which your orientation is completely toward the others. In real life, you have all sorts of hybrid cases, and sometimes also mixed cases. You have both a market exchange. You pay a bit more because, well, you like the person, or you want to help out, or whatever, to pay a higher price, and so on, right? So, of course, that's life, right?
Now, one point that I really enjoyed from the economic perspective, and I'm sure you're very deeply well-versed on this, is this idea of capital accumulation and how gratuitous benefits are actually part of a free market economy. So can you explain a bit about why it is that in a free market with capital accumulation, that's actually the environment that creates more gratuitous benefits?
Yeah. Well, the most straightforward connection is, of course, you can make gifts only if you have something to give. So the richer you are, the more you can give, right? And then, so that's the first thing. And then there's a very straight correlation. You see it in all countries. All the world is incredibly stable across time. The richer people are, the higher are the gifts that they make also, right? So there's a very strong correlation. And it's common sense. Now, the other question is, what about the willingness to make donations, right? Because you may become richer, but more stingy at the same time, right? So which means that even though you are richer now, you're still making more gifts than before, but relatively speaking, as a proportion of your wealth and your income, it becomes less. And what I argue in the book is that actually in the market economy, there are strong tendencies for people to become more generous in a free market setting, and to become more stingy under government interventionism. Now, they become more generous in a free market economy under what I call the saturation mechanism of capital accumulation. And that mechanism is has been known for a very long time, has been discussed well by Adam Smith and Karl Marx and various others. And it simply says that if people become richer, right, so then savings become more abundant, And like all things that become more abundant, they lose in marginal value. Right? Something grows in value, marginal value, to the extent it becomes scarce. Now, if something becomes very abundant, for example, savings, well, these savings lose in value. Right? So then, and the way it shows up in a market economy is that the return on investment tends to diminish on investment projects. And you have more savings available, but if the number of investment ideas and investment opportunities does not increase at the same time, you're throwing more money at the same number of opportunities. Well, the consequence is that you drive up the remuneration of the factors of production, so in particular wages and the remuneration of landed factors, so raw materials and so on. And so the return on savings, the remuneration of capital itself, of monetary capital, diminishes. And that's perfectly fine, and that's natural and so on. But the implication is that the opportunity cost of donations diminishes, right? If I have $50,000 on hand, I can earn 20% by investing the $50,000. I'm like, well, if I give them away, then in fact, I'm not only giving away 50, I'm in fact giving away 70. Right? Whereas if the return is very low, it's just 1% or so, well, then I give away, well, not 50, but 52 or something like this, right? Or 50 and a half, 51. So as a consequence, then under free market conditions, as capital accumulation grows, there is a tendency for the opportunity cost of donations to diminish. Right? So we would expect under free market conditions that there is a tendency that the people become more willing to donate money. So the amount of donations would increase not only linearly with their revenue and wealth, but slightly over proportionally. Now, that's not a rigid tendency, right? So you wouldn't expect to find with an econometric exercise a linear relationship or even a rigid relationship of a dynamic sort, because there are always countervailing tendencies, right? For example, if you have very strong technological innovation, which might create opportunities for the deployment of capital, well, then that tends to increase the return on capital investments, right? So you have two countervailing tendencies. On the one hand, people have more wealth available, but there are also greater opportunities. So the return on investment is likely to increase in that case, right? So it's a countervailing force. So it depends on the situation. But if we're just looking at people becoming richer, well, if we're just looking at this factor per se, we would think that, well, because of that, people would tend to become more willing to make donations, so relative to their income and their wealth. And there are indications that, well, in the absence of strong technological revolutions and so on, yeah, there is this tendency. And if we look back at the history of the 19th century and so on, we look, I mean, at charitable activity, but also donations to fund the sciences and the arts and so on. They've all increased very strongly, very considerably in times of strong capital accumulation.
And back to the show in a moment. The lead sponsor of this show is Swan.com, and Swan has a mission to onboard millions of people into Bitcoin. I also work at Swan, helping on some educational content for the team. Now, the team have also put out a new version of the Swan Bitcoin application, which is available on your smartphone, whether it's Apple or Android. Now, this app has a really fast onboarding experience. It's now just a few minutes to go from zero to Bitcoin. So if you are standing there with your family or friends and you might have been having trouble trying to get them onboarded, well, try this now. Recommend Swan Bitcoin. And you can do this while you're standing next to them. They can click through, and most of them will be able to set up and do this in just a few minutes. Also, the team at Swan have rolled out a new promotion. There are 0 fees on your first $10,000 of Bitcoin buys. So this is a great way to go from zero to Bitcoin, and in a guided and managed way. So reminder, go to your App Store or Play Store and search Swan Bitcoin to get onboarded with Bitcoin today. And now, back to the show. I see. And as you point out there, I mean, some of your discussion there was about donations and some of these things, but there's even the element of just sort of positive side effects or positive externalities, maybe to use the economics term, that as people become wealthier. As an example, maybe your neighbor, he's really rich and he has a beautiful garden, and you get the nice benefit of seeing that nice garden.
Exactly.
So there's this element as well, that as society in a free market, when we have capital accumulation, people become wealthier, and there's this flywheel of productivity. And that then in turn gives this kind of unintended side effects, or unintended beneficial side effects,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So a thriving economy is full of such side effects, and that each one of them is small, or tends to be small, sometimes barely perceptible. But in the mass of it, right, you're surrounded by thousands and millions of people who are thriving. This creates this sort of abundance, imperceptible, but which means the economy is actually a nice place to live in. It's beautiful, it's secure, prices are diminishing, right? So as a consumer, you're benefiting from this on a yearly basis, sometimes even on a monthly basis, and so on, right? So this is this sort of abundance which is characteristic of also market economy, right? Even the things for which you have to pay, you pay for them ever less, right? So ever smaller part of your revenue is needed to purchase the things that you need to survive, and also purchase the things that you love to do.
And on a related theme, as we were talking a little bit about virtues and sacrifice, and maybe the way we train our children to be, good, honest people, this kind of thing, even that is enabled by having more capital accumulation, isn't it? Because, people talk about low trust or high trust societies, and it's obviously beneficial. Like, most of us would like to live in a high trust society where, you can leave your laptop in the cafe and it's not stolen, or this kind of thing. So I guess you could also argue that there's like a virtue benefit that the society, as long as it's a wealthy one, it tends to create this kind of high trust dynamic.
Well, first of all, if you are wealthy, you have more time to dedicate. Well, first of all, to educating your children, spending time with your friends, taking care of your community, and so on. Whereas if you are on the verge of starvation, well, automatically you get a tunnel look on the world, tunnel vision, and all you care for is how to make it through the next day. So there's not much time to consecrate to donations, community work, and so on, and even family. Actually, right? So many families break under economic hardship. It's just a fact.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. And so let's talk a little bit about taxation and regulation. So you mentioned in the book that taxation and regulation of gifts, and particularly of inheritances, slows down capital accumulation, right? So it's the reverse of the process we were just talking about, and it reduces the willingness of private households to make gifts. So can you explain a bit around how that process occurs?
Well, if we look at capital accumulation, so I mean, for most people with very modest means, very modest revenue, the way they save is in cash, right? So they have money on the bank account. Now that is destroyed by the inflationary policies of the central bank, right? If you have constant price inflation, well, there's no incentive actually to save any amount in cash. So in fact, the 20th century and now the first 2 decades of the 21st century, they have destroyed in the working class parts of the population any culture of savings. And the transition is very brutal in countries like France and Germany, where we had very strong working class saving culture, and therefore the independence that came with it in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And you see it today also, the consequences and the behavior. So working class people feel powerless, and they are very often powerless because they have no independent means of resistance, right? And whereas things were different in the 19th century, they had independent means, and as a consequence, you also had more strikes, right? I don't say, I'm not pleading here for strikes and so on, but it's a consequence. If people become more independent, well, they have the ability to resist. Whereas today, because there are no independent means and everybody's dependent on the credit system engineered by the central bank, well, people tend to comply all the time. There's virtually no resistance to any nonsense coming out of politics today. And the consequence is are these inflationary policies. And I wanted to highlight another mechanism came into play? Well, the starting point was regulation. I immediately opt on cash savings. That was not my main point.
Yeah. So inheritances and the taking.
Thank you. Inheritance. Thank you. So these are working class people. Now, if we are looking at people who are let's say middle class investment will typically be real estate, right? And then upper middle class and the top income brackets and so on, their industrial property becomes more and more important. Right? So if we look at really wealthy people and so on, so where's the money? Either it is invested in shares through the stock market, or it is invested in the family's own business. Right? Now, the amount of money that you would commit to your own business, of course, depends on the question of continuity. Right? Your lifespan is limited. You can work until 60 or 70 and so on. Then, of course, your productivity rapidly declines. So what will happen to the company after you're gone, after you're no longer as productive as you once were? It makes a huge difference whether you can donate that company to somebody who you love or whom you feel is competent, or whether that's not possible. Now, what the taxation of inheritance does is in fact, it destroys family businesses, right? It prevents effectively the transmission of industrial property and of commercial property to your children, and thereby destroys or at least saps the incentives in the present to commit additional capital to that business. Right? If I know my children will carry on, well, of course, I will keep investing. But if I know, well, none of my children will carry on, well, then at some point I will hold back, and rather than putting the money into the company, I will invest it on the stock market or somewhere else, or buy gold coins or bitcoins. Right? and again, that's not a moral judgment. It's just, that's the mechanism. Right? So as a consequence, if you tax inheritance heavily, what you produce is a disincentive to invest in the present. Right? So you think you're only creating justice between, well, the rich guy and the rest of society, or more precisely between his presumptive heirs who have done nothing, and all other members of society say, well, the heirs are not better than the others, so why should they get all the money, and why not shouldn't we share it more generally? Well, but the problem is, again, right, you diminish capital expenditure now, and that means lower wages, right, for the people who are hired by the company. It means lower revenue for suppliers of the company, and so on, right? So you get negative effects already in the present for other people, right, that are not family members. And then the other a big problem that results from it is much more difficult to evaluate quantitatively, which concerns the quality of the management. It's a different whether you have a family business or a complete just a joint stock company with anonymous shareholder base and just some temporary caretakers called the board of the company, right? So they're not really with their tribes in the business. It's different. If you have a family business, there's a long-time relationship between the members of the family, already between the generations, the family members and their employees, the suppliers, their customers. It's a completely different thing. And you're destroying this with inheritance taxes. And it's one of these things where people think, yeah, it seems to be a good idea. It's a question of justice. Yeah, but first of all, the justice, things are not as readily evident as they seem to be, right? And then there are other consequences, which actually are negative for the people whom you claim to benefit, right? People who don't have much money and so on yet, but they are maybe the employees of that company. And maybe they're employees of all companies. There's no more family business around. And so these people are just have to compete in a shark basin, right, with all other opportunists. And maybe they would need to have a framework that takes care of their needs in a long-term relationship. You have lots of people of this around, right? Not everybody is good at playing the markets, and that holds true for the labor markets as well.
Yeah, and as you say, there's often this, let's say, leftist or egalitarian sentiment of, oh, this person is unearned, he's just earning this money unearned. In their mind, we should tax it and spread it out to society more broadly. And in their mind, they think they're being quote unquote fair or egalitarian to the rest of society. But as you were mentioning, that cuts down the process of capital accumulation. And also, as I think you mentioned in the book, that there's this family incentive that, part of the reason we might want to work is so that we can actually leave something down to our children. And so when you take that away from people with a very high inheritance tax, now there's less incentive for you to even try hard and earn and create wealth in the first place.
Yes. And also to have a family. Let's not forget that. Right? Because, well, from the outset, you cannot hand it down to your heirs. The government tells you how to use your wealth. That's not very interesting.
Yeah. And so let's talk a little bit about the welfare state. I know this is something you touch on in the book also, and that can be confused with, charity. And so there's this distinction between private charity and the welfare state. Can you outline a little bit of your thoughts on how to think about the difference there?
Well, I mean, this chapter 10 of the book, it is the longest chapter in the book, but it's probably the least original chapter in the book, because I'm mainly restating lots of points that you already find in the literature on the welfare state, right? So the problems have been known for a very long time, and the welfare state is not doing the things it's supposed to do, right? If you have an institution, you put something in place, any sort of organization, the idea is always that this organization will solve a problem. Now, the nasty thing about the welfare state is that it aggravates all the problems that it is charged with, right? You put the state in charge of housing, well, there's more housing shortages. You put it in charge of education, education levels, accomplishment levels plummet. You put it into charge of the medical system, well, it becomes ever more costly, and the quality of services, medical services diminishes, except for some technological progress and so on. Right? It's just all over the place. It's not just one unfortunate country, it's all countries, all over the world. I mean, the evidence is without appeal. It just doesn't work. And the reason has been known for a very long time, and by all people who are involved with actual charity, contrary to the welfare state, and that has something to do with incentives. Right? If you have private charity, there is a bond between the persons who provide assistance to others and these others, right? There is some mutual tit for tat. There's a mutual obligation. And as a consequence, the donor is not abusing a situation because he's giving out of love for the person. He really wants to promote that other person, help. And sometimes the help needs to be permanent. If you have a handicapped person or somebody who has terrible medical ailment and so on, right? Then it's clear, this person needs permanent support.
Right. And as you were mentioning there, the welfare state has been shown to not be effective, right? Comparing with private charity, where there's an incentive and more of I guess there's more interest in making sure that person is actually able to now stand on their own 2 feet where possible.
Exactly.
Whereas in a welfare state, as I understand, you end up with more like a dependency kind of trap where people can sometimes get into a situation where they don't want to now get out of it.
Right. And that's what we have. And the basic mechanism is that in a welfare state, people have a right to that assistance independent of their own attitudes. Right? So they don't really need to change. They just need to check the boxes. Right? I don't have a job, therefore I can claim assistance coming from taxpayer money. So people make sure that they don't have a job. Whereas in a private setting, you say, well, I helped you out because you're having a tough time. So, now I'm getting a job. Oh, fine, good, okay. And you're not hiding this from the others and say, but stay with me for another 2 weeks or something like this. And then as the job takes off, well, you're no longer dependent, you no longer lead that other mother and so on, right? So there's a mutual sense of obligation, which entices both parties to be fair to each other. Whereas in a welfare state, you just try to rip off the taxpayer as much as possible. And that's what people do. And therefore, all these problems, right? People stay unemployed indefinitely. And the people providing, the bureaucrats who are running the machine, they don't have an incentive that the problem goes away because they're being paid for administering that situation. So they're actually kind of happy for this, right? And then if you have very strong ideologues in the administration, they might actually have the idea of bringing in people from other parts of the world who will also become unemployed. right? So they have more people to take care of, have higher budgets, and get a raise, and I don't know what. So it's a very perverse system. And it's not just in handing out money to unemployed people, it's just all over the board. It just doesn't work that you forcibly fund something out of taxpayer money and make it accessible to others, make these so-called benefits accessible to others without any obligation on their part, right? In a contractual, voluntary setting. It just doesn't work. And so that's right. So that's what I restate in the chapters, and I go through the main justifications of government handouts, government benefits to other people, monopoly theory, public goods theory, and so on. And it's just without appeal, right? I mean, and most people understand this intuitively. You don't need to be a rocket science economist to understand this. Very plausible, and you see it in daily experience. It just doesn't work. Yeah. Now, some things have been new in the past 30 years, and which I also discuss in the book, is what I call the enabling state, right? Which is the welfare state times 2 or times 10. Because here the idea is that government should help people to realize themselves, right? To be all that they can be, and do, actually to be what they want to be, and to do what they want to do. And the mostly, I mean, they started off very civilly in the 18th century with Rousseau, and then the 19th century with the John Stuart Mill says, yes, society is somehow coercive, right? The individual is crushed under the impact of its environment. He needs to conform, and so on. So therefore, we need to liberate the individual, right? And at the time, there was a welfare state, but now, I mean, the same idea has been taken up and really developed with great relish. And the most extreme forms of this is just the rejection of any sort of constraints, any sort of boundaries. I mean, and it concerns national boundaries. There are no more frontiers, no more border controls, nothing, no controls there. So everybody should be able to move wherever he wants and enter any profession that he wants, and so on. And then in a way that's almost pathological is the idea that, well, I need to change my sex and my body as I wish to. And there too, right? The government should assist me with taxpayer money and all the other arrangements, right? So other people should be obliged, should be coerced into accommodating my wishes and so on. Right? So, and of course, all these things, whatever you might otherwise think about them in moral terms, psychological terms, and so on, I mean, they destroy society, right? Because society is always based on the necessity and also the willingness of people to adjust to others, right? So some sort, I mean, you can call this conformity or conformism, but it's just an adjustment to reality. It's just, I mean, if I'm walking around in the woods, I don't run against the trees because I'm adjusting to the reality. The tree is there. It is harder than I. So I have an interest in walking around it. It's not different in the case of society. Right? Certain things you just have to deal with, and I cannot have my will because that's called objective reality. Now, what the enabling state is supposed to do is to take objective reality out of our lives so that we can just live in the fantasy world as much as possible of our own wishes and fanciful thinking. And that's not a sane approach to public policy.
Of course. And as you point out, it also ends up undermining a lot of the, let's say, private governance mechanisms, whether that's the family, the church, the community, the private clubs, and all of these things are, let's say, deprioritized in favor of the state. And so it just kind of destroys a lot of these social ties and private mechanisms for governance that would have otherwise existed.
Yes. Yeah, exactly, because we relieve the individual of adjusting, right? And so then they in fact, they isolate themselves. And this is very well established for the case of unemployed people, right? Precisely because they have the government handouts, well, they no longer train themselves to learn a trade or to improve their abilities. They no longer spend any energy on becoming more desirable for others, so that others would like to cooperate with them, right? So they become fatalistic, and then in fact self-centered, completely self-centered, because you care about your little life. Oh yeah, I get my whatever $500 or $600 every month. That's good enough. I can pay the bills, my groceries, and so on. And I don't have to care for the others. Consequence is it is desocialization. And if you do this on a large scale, not only as far as the labor market is concerned, but all other things as well, then people become ever less social and socializable also. And so they become asocial and antisocial. And the most extreme expressions of these are Antifa gangs and others, right? Who are just imposing their little schemes of how the world should be on others, if needed be, by violence.
Yeah. One other topic I found quite interesting is you had some discussion on the so-called sharing economy, right? People think about Uber and Airbnb, but you actually point out that, look, even though it's branded the sharing economy, that's not necessarily the same thing as increased social integration. And in fact, these can be seen as like a social disintegration. Can you explain what you mean there?
Yeah, it's good that you pointed out. I mean, this section of the book, I presented this first at a conference in the Vatican, which that was at the height of the sharing economy frenzy. So it was 2015, 2017 in that order. Right? So then everybody went crazy. So first of all, what I point out in the book is that actually, so there are different forms of sharing, right? So sharing can be just being a co-owner with other people, right? But if we just think of co-ownership, right? Co-ownership is not necessarily something that you aspire to, that is desirable per se. And the example I give is inheritance, right? You inherit with a lot of cousins, let's say a house coming from a rich aunt. And that's not necessarily a desirable situation, because you have 10 different people, and each one of them might have a different project and how to take things further away. Or some of them might not be happy with the amount of with their part in this, and they might contest this and so on. Then you're involved for years in legal imbroglio and so on. So shared ownership is not necessarily desirable per se. But okay, and then of course you can share gratuitously. That's what most people understand when they hear the word sharing, right? I'm sharing a meal, so I invite other people to my table, they don't have to pay. But of course, in a larger sense, sharing occurs through payments also, right? I own an apartment, I rent it out to other people. It's a form of sharing my property. I could keep it for myself. I just keep it empty for the day when my mother-in-law shows up or something. Actually, my mother-in-law is a sweet lady, so I would house her in my home. But as the proverbial case, right? You lodge somebody that you don't want to have in your home, but you want to lodge him anyway. But so if I'm sharing it on the market, right, and have other people benefit from, but for payment and so on, right? So what you can show then is that actually under the impact of capital accumulation, there is a consequence that people would share to a greater extent, right? Because they have more means, right? So they can have the ability to share, and also capital accumulation, as we have said, diminishes the return on capital investments. Therefore, the incentives also to share increase and so on. You get the opposite tendencies under capital decumulation, as it typically occurs if governments become too intrusive, and so people become poorer. Right? So that you get the opposite. As far as technology is concerned, because that was the big question at the time, because the sharing economy had been associated with technological innovations, IT especially. And the interesting conclusion at which I arrived was that, in fact, there is no strong correlation between sharing and IT. Right? IT has to concern, it has to facilitate sharing specifically. Right? So if the technological advancement does not facilitate sharing this, as it is, for example, with Airbnb software, that arguably has facilitated sharing of rental space, right, and so on. But if the technology does not specifically facilitate this, then there's no strong incentive, because technological progress per se increases the return on investment and therefore reduces the amount of money that you would put into a general pot and so on. Right? So there's no strong association between technology and sharing.
Back to the show in a moment. This show brought to you by CoinKites.com, the creators of the best Bitcoin hardware security devices such as the Cold Card Mark IV and the new Cold Card Q. Now, we use Bitcoin hardware security devices to keep our keys offline, our private keys offline. Now, the way these work is you can do that setup, write down your 12 or 24 words on the seed word cards, and keep that secure. Now, you can use this device to interact with the Bitcoin network using software such as Sparrow Wallet, Electrum, or Vector Desktop, or Nunchuck as a few examples. Now, you have a range of security features that you can use with these devices, such as passphrases, you can use seed XOR, or my favorite is multi-signature. Now, if you're starting in a basic way, just start with the device and the USB-C cable, plug it directly to the computer and use it that way, and then later improve your setup. But I believe these devices are great at helping secure your coins, especially as you start to migrate up into multi-signature security. But don't be disheartened or don't be scared away. They are accessible, and I think you actually do learn about Bitcoin in the process. So to get yours, go to coinkites.com, use code Livera to get a discount on your cold card. This show also brought to you by mempool.space, the leading Bitcoin and blockchain visualizer. I use it all the time when I'm checking transaction fees and trying to understand what is the state of Bitcoin's mempool. You can search transactions, historical as well as unconfirmed ones, and also see a great way to visualize things across the Lightning Network, Liquid, mining, and so much more. Also, for those of you with an enterprise, they offer a mempool.space enterprise program. So for those of you as part of that enterprise program, you might want to get increased API limits, and you might want to have increased access to the team in terms of feature requests. You might want to have special branding in terms of how your custom instance of mempool.space looks. So to sign up for that, go to mempool.space/enterprise. And now, back to the show. I see, yeah. Another area that I think is really interesting nowadays is, people are talking about the fertility rates, right? Elon Musk is saying, everyone needs to have more children and so on. And I think in your book, you also spell out that there's a deleterious or a negative effect of a lot of government intervention and, fiat currency as well, because we are effectively, or in a broad sense, families are being forced to bear the upfront cost and sacrifice to have children, but the tax paid by those future children is being socialized to the economy, even amongst the childless. And so
Exactly.
Isn't that sort of this perverse thing that is actually driving the fertility rate down?
Oh, surely it's a major factor contributing. I mean, if you think this through, right, the welfare state has in fact been designed in order to make the traditional family less desirable, right? The welfare state comes from the socialist movement, and the socialist movement was always hostile toward the traditional family. Of course, you have almost fanatical writings like the one of Frederick Engels, right, on the family. So he was mocking the Holy Family and so on. So they always wanted to use the welfare state in order to undermine the economic incentives to bond between a man, a woman, have children, and so on. And today we have reached new excesses because I think in the US as well, but certainly in France, but in Germany, I think it's similar. Most members of parliament are childless. And actually, most governors, they have childless. I mean, President Macron in France, he doesn't have any children of his own. Madame Merkel, she didn't have any children. Scholz, now I don't know exactly where. I believe he might have a family, but it's becoming increasingly rare, right? And then Parliament is full of these people who are just dinks, right?
Double income, no kids, yeah.
No, and they are making the rules, and so the family of them, for them it is of no concern, only to the extent some electoral opportunism, right? They have some constituencies still that are families and so on. Some of them pay attention to this. But meanwhile, if you look at big metropolitan areas, New York City, Berlin, Paris, and so on, families have become a minority. So most of these people living there are single households. So that's your electorate. So don't be surprised then if you get the policies that correspond to this. But the problem is, okay, without children there's no future, and you cannot educate children in public institutions, right? There's no law in public institutions. I mean, of course, you can raise them there, which verb should be used, right? You can accompany them in their aging process and so on, but that's not raising a human person. That's not educating a young man or a young woman. So these then they grow up like savages. I mean, so our culture and civilization itself, right, is bound to disappear. And it's the error that we find in Marx, in all policies that he has inspired from Marx. Everything that is just somewhat positive is just there, right? It's just part of the environment. It falls out of the blue sky. It doesn't need to be produced. Morals, good behavior, good intentions, virtues, and so on. To the extent that it's recognized to be a positive thing at all, it's just there. You don't have to take care of it. And so you do policies. You can do this maybe for a generation, maybe also for two. But if you go on doing this and conducting policies that sap the foundations of your civilization, which is the family, which is the love bond between parents and children, and therefore also between growing animals, growing adults amongst themselves, right? Then you destroy not only the economy, it destroys civilization itself.
Yeah, and it's really a tough subject, because what we're seeing, and as you pointed out, what we're now seeing is a lot of these government leaders, so-called leaders, are almost out here being hypocritical, because they're out saying, hey, I want you to have children, but I didn't have any. That's that's the position that they are now finding themselves in, right? So even I think the Singapore prime minister or president, I think he's in that position where, Singapore has a very low fertility rate. And as you pointed out, other examples around the world. And then now I guess there's two kind of ways I'd sort of look at this, right? On one side, it's like, I don't necessarily think it's like we should be out there promoting people to have children just to make the GDP number go up, or just to help the welfare Ponzi system sustain itself for a little bit longer, right? So obviously, those are bad. But on the good side,
if
obviously,
under that motivation,
right? Yes, it's not really the right way. But on the good side, obviously, there are other reasons to have children, right? I have I have a son, and my wife and I are planning to have more children. So but we're not doing it for the GDP number go up reason, right? We're doing it because we want our family. But there are genuine benefits to that, right? Like having a bigger population means there might be more geniuses who are born, who are highly skilled entrepreneurs and scientists and economists and whatever, and they will make the future society far richer, as opposed to being a poorer society with less division of labor, less specialization of labor possible, less future demand possible. There's just so many bad effects that are going to come from this sort of declining population. So I guess it's going to be a real challenge, isn't it?
The motivations that prompt these policies, they are always opportunists, right? So you want to sell people additional liberties. I give you additional money, additional help coming from the state. So we're making your life easier. And that's true, right? It's true. But the little problem is it's coming under at the point of a gun, so under the constraint of other people. As a consequence, you're no longer balancing this. You're no longer adjusting your life to the needs of others. It's no longer a give and take with others. It's something where you're living your own egoistic interests at the expense of others. And if this is only one person who does this and the others are very numerous, you barely feel it. But of course, if everybody is behaving like this, I mean, that's a disaster. And these policies, which were designed to facilitate the life for everybody, so it's a typical aggregation problem, right? It's a fallacy of composition. Although it's true for one individual, it's not necessarily good for society as a whole. Here, it's quite catastrophic. So the truth of the matter is that, natural associations such as the family and other communities of people who band together in order to help each other out, all which are based on love, commitment to the shared objectives or shared virtues or whatever, right? They hold and they are productive, whereas everything that thrives only under taxpayer funding, so at the point of the gun, others are being forced to subsidize this. Well, this tends to be not productive, but in fact turns people into prisoners of their own selves, right? Of their own petty projects at the moment, because they no longer adjust to the needs of others. That's the basic problem.
Yeah, and I think also in the book you do touch on a little bit around the economics of more females going into the workforce and then less men actually wanting to get married and having children as well. Could you elaborate a bit on what's happening there?
Well, I mean, for again, right? If we think of the family, then if there's no love, there is no family. Okay, so of course you need all these. You need these basic virtues. You need affection. You need to have loyalty, so commitment to this and so on. Right? All these virtual dispositions toward the other. Right? Without this, it doesn't work. But of course, at the margins, right, the family always depends also on the economic incentives. So why do people band together? Well, because men and women are actually complementary. So they're, from an economic point of view, they're perfect for the division of labor, because the division of labor thrives on people not being equal, but on being different. And men and women tend to be different but complementary. Right? They're different strengths, right? Physical, emotional, intelligence, and so on. Right? They're complementary, social, psychological, and so on. And therefore they make for a good, from the outset, right? They make for a good pair, and they are very productive. Right? If you have a man and a woman who love each other, they can achieve incredible things. One of the things is raising a family. So it's just one of the things. Now, if you change the economic environment, then of course the perspective changes as well. Many women love their children more than their husband, at least after a while, right? And sometimes it's also, I mean, the reason why they get married is in order to have children. Right? That's their main motivation. I mean, they love this other person, but it's actually okay. Yeah, it's but the main thing that really motivates them is the children. Now comes the state and tells them, look, I mean, you don't have to get married. I mean, we'll pay you money anyway. You can have all the children, and we actually pay you money for the children. There are many girls who take this offer right away, and well, they have actually 5 children with 5 different boyfriends. And it's a business model, right? And for a man, this is typically is not interesting. Right? It's not interesting to be the boyfriend or the 5th or the 6th or whatever boyfriend of this lady, contribute marginally to life. That's not really what you aspire to, because you want also, if you dedicate time and resources to this, you want to build something, right? You know, to build something, well, it needs to be, I mean, it is not your private property, but in a way, right, it's yours, right? It's yours, and so there needs to be stability. Now, the welfare state saps that stability because it reduces the exit costs, especially for women, not so much for men, but especially for women, right? And as a consequence, the risks for failure, for family failure, increase. And because you know this from the outset, well, you have less incentives to get into the marriage bond, because you know that the probability of failure is incredibly high. Look at divorce statistics. I mean, in some countries, you almost need to be crazy to get married, because it's almost sure that within 3 years, you will get a divorce. I just said, we had our oldest daughter at home. She's 25. She had been at the, a ceremony of her best friend. She's a fiancée. She got fiancée with a young man, and this was ended after 1 week. Okay, so it was not yet marriage, but it just shows. I mean, that right, this institutional environment, it creates an attitude which is no longer geared toward the long term and toward building something productive and so on, but it's just geared toward personal satisfaction, very hedonistic attitude toward life.
Right. there's been this loss in our culture, let's say, that, because people can't save, because people can't form families, it's starting to, cause these problems where, let's say, the fertility rate is low and there are all these other, let's say, social, cultural problems of the day. So, yeah, that's quite unfortunate. I am curious as well, somebody could look back to you and say, look, in the book, you said that there are ways where we are becoming less wealthy. Now, part of that is, as we would both agree, there's capital consumption happening. There's negative interest rates at different points. But on the other hand, people might say, look, there are other ways in which we are richer, right? We have the internet, we have internet calling, and we have maps and air travel and all of these things. How do you sort of weave that? Would you just sort of say, look, there's some ways we've gotten wealthier, but other ways we've become poorer?
Yeah, fortunately, life is not a one-dimensional affair, right? Fortunately, it's not all black. I mean, there are always good evolutions taking place simultaneously, right? I mean, we've benefited in the past 40 years substantially from the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, that was probably the most momentous improvement for the general welfare of the world population. So suddenly, this huge part of the world economy, China, but also the whole Soviet orbit, was brought into the worldwide division of labor. And that's beneficial not only for those countries, but especially for all others. And of course, it's very clear if you're a consumer in Western Europe or in North America, I mean, lots of things that you purchase on a daily basis, almost, right? They come from China and East Asian countries. Lots of energy and so on other resources came out of Russia and so on, right? So this was an incredible boom, right? And then simultaneously, we also had significant technical progress in various areas, most notably IT, but other areas as well. We're a bit more skeptical of nanotechnology and so on, but mainly IT. And this creates, of course, an incredible productivity boost, right? So fortunately for us, we have benefited from all these positive factors, and therefore the decline that we have in moral and cultural substance has been dampened. Right? Otherwise, it would have been felt much more brutally. But of course, large parts of that progress that I just mentioned has also been taken away by the state. Right? Our growth rates would have been significantly higher if we had kept the same regulatory and tax environment that we had in the 1980s. Right? So since then, I mean, if you just, it's regulation, growing regulation, even more so than growing tax rates. Tax rates have not increased that dramatically, but especially the tax base, right? So the things that you tax have increased in numbers, and then the regulation of business, which have increased costs enormously, right? And the only reason why we don't feel this so much is because we have made these huge productivity gains elsewhere, thanks to the division of labor, thanks to technological progress. So this was barely perceptible, right? But it's I mean, the state helped itself greatly to it. I would say probably the political sphere, they absorbed the lion's share of the progress that we had in the past 40 years. And there's still progress for the population at large. And most people only compare their present situation to how it had been before. So therefore they're happy because it's been improved. But if they could see how much better they would have been if all that had not taken place, then they would grow very angry.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I think I agree with you there. One other area, I guess I'm kind of just curious to get your thoughts on how there's almost this cyclical nature to it. I mean, there's even that meme floating around, everyone talks about it, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times, etc. I'm curious, are we just kind of doomed to kind of keep going through these cycles, or is it actually, hypothetically, like if we had sound money and there was actually real capital accumulation, couldn't things continually just get better? Or is it do you think that there's just like something not economic related that just causes this kind of cyclical aspect?
And I believe, I mean, that's our human condition. We always have this kind of trouble. We have just to live with it. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to change it. And the way I see it, if we get progress, was always, progress doesn't come linearly. It doesn't come smoothly. Progress comes in big spurts. It's like wealth. Right? Most big fortunes that are built up, they don't come over in tiny increments over 100 years. They come in big spurts over a few years. And then it depends on what people make out of it. Do they waste it? Do they sell it away in consumption? Or do they keep investing it? And then usually, I mean, the investments that you make, they come in smaller increments. Or sometimes you're happy if you keep the substance halfway and so on. And as far as political things are concerned, it's very similar. Right? The big progress comes on a few occasions, few big spurts, like in Argentina right now. I mean, Argentina is falling back on its feet through this brutal policy being led by Xavier Milei. And irrespective of whether he will have himself lasting success, you will see it through the end of his mandate or get another mandate and so on. The country itself will benefit from this for many years. Okay, simply because he's taken off so much of the fat that was there and that was just crushing the country. Right? Too much government. I mean, too many people will just produce more rules and more taxes and don't contribute to the satisfaction of the needs of the others. That's a big problem. And you see it in other areas as well. Take the American Revolution, right? It was one big sweep and it changed the situation dramatically throughout many generations. And of course, right, then it was slowly taken away, right? The year of Lincoln and various other tyrants that bring back the big state, big government, and so on. But that's the fight that we have to lead, right? And we in order to improve things, well, you first of all need to educate yourself. You need to make sure enough people know what you know and share your motivations and share your insights. And then if the conditions are propitious, you can get sweeping change, like in the US in 1776 and like in Argentina in 2023, like in Britain under Margaret Thatcher. So, I mean, these things do happen. They don't happen, unfortunately, every year. Sometimes things have to become very bad. But then at some point, people wake up and they're fed up and they see that all these other so-called recipes don't work. And then they try something desperate, even something that everybody told them would never work and is a terrible thing to do, like libertarian economic policies. And they do it.
Fantastic. Well, look, I think we should start to wrap up. So I guess one of the, for me, one of the key lessons that I learned in reading the book is understanding that a lot of donations and positive side effect goods, they flourish and they come when we have the free market. And sadly, when we have the state that's, taking too much control of the economy, whether that's regulation, whether it's taxes, it tends to make our worldview smaller and it becomes more focused about survival. And, it sort of destroys the true source of gratuitous goods, whether that's families and friendship and private associations and business and the market. So I guess if you had, one takeaway for listeners, what would be the closing thought or the final takeaway for them?
Well, in practical terms is, well, as you have said, right? Stop thinking that by asking for more government involvement, you would make the world more compassionate, less selfish, and so on. It's the exact opposite that is true, right? And if the book only conveys to you the reasons why this is the case, why you need liberty and private property in order to make the life more generous and more abundant, unpaid abundance, well, then the book will have accomplished all it's meant to accomplish.
Excellent. Well, listeners, I'll put the link in the show notes. You can get it for free over on the Mises.org website, or of course buy the paperback or a physical copy. The book is called Abundance, Generosity, and the State. And thank you for joining me today, Dr. Hulsmann.
Great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it out there with your family and friends. Check out my website at stefanlivera.com, and I will see you in the Citadels.